is based on use values or one that is based on exchange values? Why would we not think about society in which basic use values, housing, healthcare, education, transportation, are essentially delivered as free goods to everyone, available on an equal basis, and not regulated by market mechanisms in which the rich can gain considerable preference over the poor? I would rather live in that use value society. And it's not impossible. There have been periods when countries, Scandinavia, Britain in the 1960s, went some way towards that world of providing basic use values free to the whole population. And they gained the resources by taxing the wealthy and taxing capital. Capital obviously didn't like it. So since the 1970s, what have we seen in Britain? We've seen the privatization of housing. What used to be social housing is now privatized. We see the privatization of education. We see the privatization, creeping privatization of healthcare. And of course, if you go to the United States, it's all privately orchestrated, all profit-oriented, with vast extractions of wealth occurring. So if I go back to that basic contradiction between use value and exchange value, I would follow Marx and say, let's try to create a society which is basically concerned with the delivery of use values to the population, keeping exchange value as much as possible out of the picture. Let us have an alternative utopian project in which we have a society which is based on the provision of use values with no exchange value component ever involved. That could be part of a left-wing utopian project. Let us similarly take the monetization and the way money as a form of social value which can be appropriated by private persons is also restructured. In other words, it's possible by an analysis of how capital works and how its contradictions are structured to come up with an alternative utopian framework, not a project, an alternative utopian framework. And this alternative framework uses the existing contradictions within capital and uses them in these constructive kinds of ways to define what our politics might be about. Now, of course, what we live in is a society which is global and where there are strong global connections. So it becomes extremely difficult for any government to extract itself from the whole world system, if you want to call it that, without making compromises. So nobody is talking here about somehow or other cutting ourselves off from the world and trying to define a space in which somehow or other we can live in this utopian world, because we won't be able to do it. But the purpose of analyses of what is, of good analyses of what is capital and how does capital work, is precisely to define a project around the question of what is the alternative. If we don't want that system to work what must we take out of that system, and how would we make it work better, differently? If we review this, there is in fact considerable incentive to do exactly what I'm talking about. For example, there are many organizations that exist internationally as well as nationally that say that housing should be viewed as a human right, not as a commodity. Healthcare should be viewed as a human right, not a commodity. Education should be viewed as a human right, not as a commodity. So it's not as if there are not movements around that are actually arguing in this vein, but one of the ways in which we can put these arguments more coherently together is to have a very coherent understanding of how capital works. Because capital is also extremely flexible. It's extremely subtle sometimes in the way in which it works. And very often projects which look like they're anti-capitalist can be subverted, turned around, so that they become part of the capitalist apparatus. So my pleasure at having this book published now in Portuguese is the hope that people looking at it and trying to grapple with many of its arguments will both get a better picture of how capital works, what the logic of capital is about, and at the same time get a sense of how some of the categories that Marx introduces about rent and interest, merchant capital and the like, how some of those categories can help us understand what is actually happening in urbanization. I think it's significant that many of the struggles that have erupted around the world over the last 15, 20 years have been urban struggles. It's not that there are not rural struggles, and we can talk about that later. But the focus of discontent has shifted, it seems to me, from fighting over what goes on inside the factory to fighting on what goes on in the city as a whole. And I think there are very good reasons for that shift. Because capital is now extracting a great deal of value out of urbanization. And it's actually extracting a great deal of value out of urban life. And there's an interesting theoretical point, which I really didn't make in Limits to Capital, which comes blindingly obvious when I was doing the companion to Volume 2, which is where capital creates the surplus is not the same as where it realizes it. A surplus can be created in a factory in China. It will be realized by Walmart selling that stuff in the United States. So the merchant capitalist gets the surplus, not the producer. It's possible for the financier to get the surplus, not the producer. It's possible also for the landlord to get the surplus, not the producer. And it's possible also to make concessions to labor so that they have a higher wage and then recapture all of that money which the laborer earns through higher rents, through profiteering of merchants' capital. Telephone companies are my favorite example. I hate them. I mean, I don't know if this happens to you, but the amount of little bills that go on your telephone bill is so enormous. I mean, this is This is an extraction of surplus from you by merchant capital. And of course, credit cards. So capital is sitting these days and saying, all right, well, we'll exploit the worker in the place of production, but we're also, to the degree they get better wages, we'll suck it all back in these other forms. And of course, what we see in housing markets is quite simply that it's almost impossible for majority of the population now to find a place to live that doesn't absorb more than half of your income. And you know, the standard argument is it should never absorb more than 1/3 of your income, housing, you know. But it's becoming extremely difficult. There are some people who are spending 60% of their income on housing. That is, rental extractions are becoming more and more significant. And the power of the rentier right now is much stronger than it has been in the past. Again, that introduces back into the picture the whole question of the role of rent on property, the role of rent on intellectual property rights, the role of rent in the form of interest, so, and the way in which profit on merchant capital is being extracted. So these things are all related. And what I like about Marx is the way in which there is this framework for understanding how capital works, understanding why some of the things that go on around us do, being able to say to people, this is the way capital works. It's not your fault that you're in this situation. And I think if we can get to that point of a collective understanding through working through books of this kind and understanding the texts of Marx and so on, we would be in a much better position politically to start to make arguments about what would be a coherent path to construction of some alternative. So why don't I leave it there? Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Agora a gente passa para o momento das questões. Convido a todos para encaminharem questões por escrito aqui para frente. O pessoal do teatro vai circular recolhendo. Enquanto isso, a gente vai fazer um agrupamento temático e passamos aí para um segundo momento com uma leva de questões.
She asked for 5 minutes to... Okay, very, very good.
Só lembrando que as questões podem e preferencialmente devem ser escritas em português, de tal forma que elas serão feitas em português e traduzidas para o Harvey pela tradutora simultânea.
Se anunciar que depois, então, vão ser feitos depois das perguntas, então tem um autógrafo. Vamos se anunciar.
Ao fim da sequência de questões, a gente vai fazer uma breve sessão de autógrafo com o Harvey no foyer ali, perto da escada por onde vocês entraram. Só esse informe. Mas, felizmente, nós conseguimos aqui organizar eixos de tópicos, de preocupações gerais. Está me acompanhando? Eixos de tópicos e temas gerais em comum, que nos permite aqui englobar um pouco temas que preocupam aqui nosso público no Rio de Janeiro. Antes de fazer a primeira questão ao Harvey, veio uma mensagem aqui do público perguntando sobre a possibilidade dele publicar versões gratuitas na internet de seus livros para tornar mais acessível sua leitura. Nesse sentido específico, acredito que seja um tópico interessante comentar que o Harvey chamou do Projeto Marx envolve, dentre outras coisas, uma prática que ele tem já há alguns anos de apresentar aulas sobre Marx publicamente. São aulas capítulo a capítulo dos volumes diversos do Capital. E essas aulas foram publicadas no site do David Harvey, cujo endereço é davidharvey.com, que foram gravadas com o intuito de disponibilizar na internet, de forma acessível, esses cursos de acompanhamento numa leitura do Capital, que não é uma leitura fácil e que é muito difícil de ser feita sozinho. Não deve ser feito sozinho, não é um livro, não são obras pensadas